This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the podcast, where I'm talking to veg growing expert Huw Richards. Huw grows a vast range of plants in his garden in Midwest Wales and is always trialling and experimenting with new ways of growing. He has an enormously popular YouTube channel and has authored a number of books, the latest of which is the Vegetable Grower's Handbook, which draws on his experience as very much a thoughtful and philosophical gardener. He begins the book by stating that it's a good idea to start our growing year with a mission statement, and I asked him why he believes these are useful.
I like to take ideas from different spheres of life, and I love gardening, but I love other aspects, and sometimes I can see certain ideas or thoughts that can actually be applied in the gardening world. So, for example, in business, many businesses have a mission statement. I'm trying to think of one at the moment, but Google's mission statement is along the lines of to make information accessible to all, for example. So I thought so many gardeners have lots of different goals and they always go into springtime excited about everything. And then very often we can get distracted and veer off, and actually at summer we're actually, hang on a minute, what were we really working towards? And sometimes as well, when we feel a bit overwhelmed, we kind of lose a bit of motivation. So for me, having a garden mission statement, it clearly outlines my purpose, because if this is my purpose, then I kind of use that as a filter. Anything that I'm doing in the garden, I run it by my mission statement. If it's aligned or related, then that's great. If it's completely not related, then I question if that's maybe my best use of time, because life is so busy. We've got to make the most of having as much fun and satisfaction as possible when we are actually in the garden.
Yeah, and would your mission statement evolve over time, or would it remain constant?
Oh, it's changing every year. Last year, my mission statement was to escape from a busy world and relish every harvest. This year, my mission statement is to grow for flavour, not productivity. And I think it's really important at the end of every growing season to just reflect, see where you're at. For me, I'm constantly trying new things, and I don't know, I just get captured by bright, shiny objects in the form of a new way of making compost, for example. The gardening style is always adapting. I feel that sometimes gardeners can get caught in a trap where they maybe feel like they've kind of plateaued and they're not sure how to push through to the next stage. And for me, a big part of trying to avoid that is soaking in as much inspiration from other areas of gardening or different other areas of food production from different climates, and then adapting it for how it will make sense in my Welsh garden.
There's a lot to be said, I think, for being organised, and you do advocate for that, such as keeping checklists, batching jobs, planning. But I wondered how people can get into these habits, because certainly for me, I'm kind of a bit busy in the garden. I'm running around. I sometimes think, I could be a lot more organised, but I feel that my time that I would spend planning is better spent in the garden, and especially if people are firefighting when the growing season starts. So how can people get into those habits of being organised and setting the time aside to plan?
Well, the basic thing is take a notebook with you up into the garden. You should never go into the garden and be all gung-ho all the time. You need to just sit back and relax and spend a bit of time actually enjoying the space. And that's where I feel like I have a bit of a clearer head. And what I'd say is the best way to start is, go up into the garden, do a load of jobs, stop, have a cup of tea, and kind of you've got your thoughts all fresh in your mind, and just jot down a few tasks that you have to do that are upcoming, and then just prioritize them. And then you have a mission to continue with the rest of your gardening session, or at the end of the gardening session, by creating that, you know what to do next time. Not everything will always go to plan, but for me, what I do is just whenever I have a bit of a spare moment, and we always have like a spare minute or two here and there, waiting for the tea to brew, sometimes it's just so useful getting something down on paper, because I can't tell you how many times I've gone to the garden when I was meant to do one thing and I completely forgot about it, only to remember later that night, oh no, I didn't sow the tomatoes. So it's just a way of just collating thoughts and not trying to remember everything.
I think that's really useful. You obviously do take the time to reflect on your practices, and it's a slightly off-piste question, but I wondered if throughout your gardening journey, are there any interesting or surprising things that you've discovered about yourself or the way you look at the world?
I think for me, I can't remember where I heard this from, but it's along the lines of the more you learn about something, the more you realize how much you don't know. And I think that's the case with gardening. For me, I'm always very curious. I try and approach things very creatively. And when it comes to a garden, I thought it can be as simple as you want, but I don't like simple. I like things being really interesting and pushing against the grain because I want to see what happens and have a very kind of what if attitude. What if that works out? Well, it would be amazing. If it doesn't, so what? I had fun. I think the main thing that I've learned is that there is actually so many amazing things out there. And it's about then how can I try and share these ideas in the most accessible way possible? Because to grow potatoes, I could think of nearly 20 different ways of growing a potato. And sometimes I feel, especially for new gardeners, they maybe haven't quite found the method or something that really either works for them or works with what resources they have available. So because I'm sharing what I'm doing, I feel a responsibility to try and learn as much as possible to then pass on to my audience.
Sort of getting more into the nitty-gritty of your gardening techniques, you do a lot of intercropping, and your garden, I suppose, I would describe it, it's relatively complex. There's a lot going on. So in terms of tracking when things are ripe and what is where and when you need to harvest it, how do you do that? Is that more tricky given that your things are quite mixed together?
I don't think so. Usually I start off with the basis of doing kind of a monthly planting plan. So it's just a rough idea of what will be going in and out every month throughout the season. So knowing what I need to start, say, 2-3 weeks before to then transplant. But really, I don't follow crop rotation, for example, only if something really serious has happened, like carrot root fly, and I'm not going to want to grow carrots in that same bed for another 2 or 3 years at least. So for me, I actually feel that having that freedom and flexibility makes it so much easier. And yes, my garden looks very complex, but there's a lot of intuitive aspects about it where I think, actually, there's a little space there. I could fit in a row of dwarf beans, or, oh, I'd actually really like to fill that little corner with maybe some dill, some parsley, or some borage. I really like a kind of a carefully considered but natural looking aesthetic. So that mixing of plants, even though it may seem complex, most of the time it's me just spotting a little gap and thinking, oh, I've got some spare seedlings of this. Let's put it in and see what happens.
Yeah, I really liked that because I'm not very good at throwing odd seedlings away or random plants. And I love the idea of your odds and ends beds. And I am actually going to do that myself this year. So I wondered if you could just explain what that is and why it can inspire new ways to grow.
Yeah, so the odds and ends bed is, well, if you're growing on a patio, it could be a large container, for example. But for me, I always have those spare seedlings, and I don't really follow companion planting that closely. I usually take what its core goals are, but kind of adapt it to actually trying to make sure that I have the space to grow enough food and still bring in the pollinators, etc. So the odds and ends bed is actually a chance to give an opportunity for those spare seedlings to grow through and create a harvest, but they're not my absolute priority. So what I will do is I'll actually start planting them either a lot more closer together or stacking them in different layers or mixing them with other different crops just to see how they grow and how they perform. And funnily enough, last year in my odds and ends bed, I grew the biggest Swiss chard I've ever grown before. And I think the reason why is that I had planted everything so close. There were peas, there were broad beans, there was lettuce, there was onions, all kind of compacted. Once those are harvested kind of by summer, it then allowed the Swiss chard to just absolutely flourish. And so it missed the really hot weather and it just turned into this mega plant, which it's still going today.
Wow. I mean, are there downsides to planting closely?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. Sometimes at the start of a new season, I have a tendency to oversow if I'm sowing directly, because I think sometimes I need to have a little bit more faith in seed germination. And so last year I sowed about 5 rows of Swede and I thinned it 3 times and it still wasn't enough. So I think just spacing in terms of direct sowing, if you're just transplanting it, it's a lot easier to actually have that spacing. But it's something that I know I'll also do again this year, but I've accepted that.
Fair enough. I was really intrigued as well by your idea of multi-sowing, and I suppose that relates to that in a way. Can you explain what that is?
Multisowing is actually a method that's been used by commercial growers for many, many decades. And it's actually a way, it's almost like if you think about a skyscraper, you cram a lot into a small space. So the idea with multisowing is instead of planting 1 seed per module, you might plant 5 or 6, and then the 5 or 6 plants just grow away from one another. For example, radish or peas or beetroot. So instead of, say, my standard module tray I use is 40 cells, instead of growing 40 individual beetroot or radish plants, I can actually extend that to 160, 200 plants being raised in a size just a bit bigger than a bit of A4 paper. And then when I transplant them, in a matter of minutes, I've planted the equivalent of 200 or 300 plants. And the speed and efficiency is amazing. And as well, windowsill space, or say if you've got shelving units to start off your seedlings, it's actually very precious, limited space. So this allows you to pack in a lot more in the same area.
Yeah, it's a brilliant idea. I have to say, I was through it again. It's definitely something I'm going to be taking away from the book. You garden very sustainably. Can you talk a bit about how you harvest water in your garden? Because I thought that would be useful for people, particularly if they're not maybe on mains water.
Yeah, well, we're in a unique position where we have access to a stream. So we dam the stream a little bit further up and then lead a pipe into our IBC tanks. That's one of the ways that we do it. The other way, of course, is rainwater. And so when we've had droughts in previous years, we'll line up loads of containers and buckets and even wheelbarrows down this shed roof that really it needs guttering, but it's a little bit of an awkward position to do it. So we just fill up as much as possible. And then after a heavy downpour, it's amazing how all of those are filled up really quickly. Now, one of the things that I'm going to be doing a video about a little bit later on this season is actually rainwater collection using a tarpaulin. So if you use a large tarpaulin around 5 by 5 meters, for example, and you tie it to just 4 posts and then you just bring it into a big bucket or something, you can actually capture a huge amount of water. And because it's a tarpaulin, when it stopped raining, you can easily just put it away and put it back on again whenever it's needed. And there's this really important calculation that I think any gardener should do whatsoever, is to understand the water capture potential that roofs give them. So if you have a greenhouse, if you have a garden shed, if you have a garage, for example, what you can do is you can use a calculator, which is basically working out your average yearly rainfall for your local area. That's really easy to find online. And then doing a calculator which combines that with the square meters of space that you have, of roof potential space, and then it will give you a figure of how much water you could potentially capture. So I did one for my parents' house, for example, and we worked out something ridiculous where we could capture over 100 cubic meters of water a year at least on a fairly dry year. So roofs are such a beautiful asset for gardeners in terms of capturing the water. And even if you are on mains, I do this anyway because it's going to save you money.
They are such an untapped potential, roofs. And it is such an important thing to do.
That was no pun intended, right?
Yeah, exactly. I thought that as soon as I said it. But what struck me about your garden is that it is, for a garden that's so productive, it is incredibly attractive as well. And you've got
Thank you.
quite a clever way of making your IBC tanks look attractive. How do you do that?
Well, I'm quite an odd person. I quite like how IBC tanks look by themselves, but I understand that some people don't. So there's two ways of dealing with that. Well, there's three really. I'll work backwards. So the third way is just grow some kind of evergreen climbing or hedging type thing around it, like a box, just to hide it visually all through the year. The second option is during the growing season, you can grow peas or runner beans, and I love to grow sweet peas as well up my IBC tanks, because then it kind of creates a nice screen. And also what happens is that these tanks, water is a great holder of heat. So if you grow things such as runner beans, I found that my runner beans growing up an IBC tank versus a normal trellis or A-frame are ready to harvest around 2 weeks earlier, because I think it helps keep a more constant temperature, a warmer temperature overnight, and it actually speeds up their development. And then the other thing that you can do is actually you can tie pallets to an IBC tank and then transform those pallets into planters. So you can grow things like your herbs or marigolds or, some nice violets, etc., and turn it into a nice living wall.
Yeah, it's a really good idea. I love that. Thinking about this year in particular, are you trialling any new veg? Or, obviously, flowers as well. Have you got anything new on?
Yeah, I'm trialing over 100 things that I've never grown before.
Anything particularly excited about?
Oh, I don't know where to start. Exploding cucumbers. Those are going to be really interesting. There's this type of tomato, I've forgotten the name. It's on the Real Seeds catalogue. It's basically lots of micro cherry tomatoes that fuse together to form a fruit. It looks really wacky, and I'm growing that because it looks like a lot of fun. And then I'm growing a lot more kind of heritage varieties. I really love heritage varieties and their story and how they were grown for flavour, not like massive crops. I'm not a really big fan of the whole giant veg movement. I don't see the appeal of it because I understand like the pride of look at my really long carrot. But in terms of practicality reasons, etc., or in terms of flavour and nutrition, you're not going to get the best nutrient flavour from those giant varieties. What you are going to get is from the heritage varieties, because a lot of these modern varieties as well are bred purely for how much they produce rather than focusing on how tasty they are. And taste is a direct correlation on nutrition. So, it's more like 150 crops that I'm trialing. Many of those are heritage varieties that I've tracked down and I'm going to be trying myself. So I've started this new project on a much bigger site that gives us the ability to scale up these trials and experiments. And then anything that I feel works really well or is worth sharing, then either bring that into the garden or share it with others and recommend it and just show people how much diversity there is when it comes to choice. I honestly feel that a garden for me is a blank canvas. It's my artist canvas, and I paint it with all of the different plants that I can grow. And I don't want to settle for just the standard carrots, beetroot, potatoes, peas, beans, and all those normal varieties that you can easily buy from a garden centre. In all of those different crops, I want to make sure that each one has a little bit of magic about them that you could never possibly get from a supermarket or even your local market garden.
You do strike me, when I read the book, it seems that you have a very artistic eye and you're also a very philosophical gardener, I think.
I've been called that before. The thing is, the philosophy to me always leads to the practicality. Otherwise, I feel like I'm just doing it blind. I use like the ideas and the philosophy to guide the actions, not just a little bit of woo philosophy and then not do anything about it. I do everything for an action and an obvious end result in the garden.
And did the philosophy side were you always interested in?
No, it came out of, it's a good question actually. It came out of me suddenly realising that I don't think I like gardening. I wasn't enjoying it as much. It was about 3 years back, I think, something like that. And I went through a little bit of an internal crisis just on the gardening side. And I thought, why was this happening? And I guess that deep thought of why kind of opened up this whole new journey of trying to discover as many new things as possible and not always follow the mainstream. And it's so much more fun, to be honest, now. I think I care a lot less, which is, I think, quite a blessing in disguise, because I feel that, like anything, there can be a lot of judgment in like the gardening sphere and everything. And I feel kind of proudly independent. And I think everyone, when it comes to the garden, do things that make you the happiest. Don't grow something in a way just because Terry next door tells you that's the only way you can grow those peas. Do things that make you happiest. And that's the mantra I've been following now since that kind of mini gardening crisis. And I swear to you, every single day, I just get more and more excited and passionate about growing. And I'm a bit scared to think about where this is going to lead me in 10 years' time, whether I'm literally going to just live in a garden and never leave it. But who knows?
So I noticed that in your book, you advocate for no-dig gardening. How do you feel about no-dig? And is it still the right way to go? Should we stop digging altogether? Is this, a very important thing for you?
Well, for me, no-dig is the foundation of the way that I grow. However, I think one thing I should have perhaps made more clearly in the book is that it's to do with what I've been saying earlier, is actually grow the way that you enjoy the most. No-dig for me makes sense in terms of soil health and everything. But if someone is growing their own food, I don't really care what method they're using. I'm just delighted that they're growing food. I'd rather anyone grow food and dig and do whatever versus being scared by it, because I'm worried actually. I used to spend a lot of time on Facebook groups, and I think they're kind of quite dangerous now because I got to a stage where I could barely go a day without seeing a dig versus no dig debate. And I just wish that sometimes, rather than focusing in the fine details, people should just take a step back and actually celebrate the fact that we are growing our own food. We're all allowed to choose the methods that work for us. And I don't think it's fair when you try and force or argue against people. It's like, when you think about it, we're all still growing vegetables and we've got that like-minded mission. So yeah, it's a bit of a frustration that I have. You also asked in that question whether I think that no dig is the be all and end all. I don't. I think that it can absolutely be improved. And so this year, right now, literally as I speak, a fence is going up around this new experimental garden that I'm doing, which I'm doing a control no-dig bed and then 11 other experiments with the goal of building upon no-dig to improve it, both in terms of the crop output, in terms of nutrition and taste, and also productivity, but also in terms of finding ways to make food growing more affordable for people. So using different materials, for example, not just focusing on compost, looking at things like grass clippings, like biochar and wood chip, and creating our own amendments. So it's going to be really interesting. This is going to be a bit of my kind of passion project, but really drilling in those 11 really carefully planned ways of trying to build upon no-dig and also make gardening more affordable for people.
Thank you very much to Huw for sharing his perspective on gardening. I very much enjoyed our chat. And thanks to you for listening. Dr. Ian Bedford is here now talking about a very sneaky bug.
One of the most successful taxonomic groups of insects on Earth is Diptera, with over 100,000 species already recorded, out of more than 1 million that are thought to exist worldwide. Dipterans are the true flies, with just one pair of wings, unlike other flying insects such as dragonflies and butterflies, which have 2 pairs. And there'll be many true flies that visit our gardens each year, who will demonstrate just how amazingly diverse they are in appearance, behaviour, and the roles they play within an ecosystem. And one that's certainly worth looking out for during spring and early summer is the dark-edged bee fly. Bee flies, of which there are 10 species in Britain, are so called because they look like small bumblebees with plump furry bodies and emit a high-pitched buzz as they fly amongst the plants. However, they don't sting, and their single pair of wings and long spear-like tongue that protrudes from their head clearly shows they are not a bee. The dark-edged bee fly is the most common of the bee flies and is an astonishingly fast and adept flyer, able to hover motionless in front of a flower while siphoning nectar before vanishing in the blink of an eye. But why would these flies have evolved to look like a not-so-skillful flying bee? Well, perhaps mimicking a stinging insect deters certain predators, but it's also likely that it helps the bee fly accomplish a sinister part of its life cycle. Since the dark-edged bee fly is actually a lethal parasite and, looking like a bee, probably enables it to get close to its prey, the solitary mining bees, and perform its rather devious egg-laying procedure. Having located a colony of mining bees, the female bee flies hover nearby. Then as the bees finish excavating their nests, lay their eggs and store pollen for their resulting grubs, the flies move closer and, whilst continuing to hover, begin flicking their eggs into the nests before the entrances are sealed by the bees. Then as the fly eggs hatch into maggots, they start by feeding on the stored pollen before finally consuming their main course, the mining bee grubs. The maggots then pupate, ready to emerge as the next generation of fluffy bee fly adults that once again begin their lives buzzing amongst the flowers and innocently drinking nectar.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.